We're going to start this session. Our first speaker is great, is coming, is a PhD student from Israel, Rony, who is going to tell us her work that she's doing in a PhD on consciousness.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here. And I want to start by asking you to imagine that someone offers you a pill. And if you take it, you're going to live the best life that you can possibly imagine. You're going to create things of great value. You'll be surrounded by family and friends. You will get all the funding that you want, but you will not consciously experience any of it. From the outside, no one will suspect that you're not conscious, right? Your behaviors, your actions would seem as if you are, so no one will ever suspect it. But in this best life scenario, you'll have zero experience that any of it is going on. And the question is, would you take the pill? By a show of hands. Okay, interesting. If you said no, I want to invite you to think, what is that thing that you're not willing to give up on when not taking the pill, when not giving up on consciousness? And maybe it's something like experiences like looking at the sunsets, right? Feeling the breeze on your hair, or if you don't have hair on your face, watching the clouds floating in the sky. Intuitively, you all know what I'm talking about. We are intimately familiar with our conscious experience. But how do we make sense of it? How can we even pinpoint what exactly it is that we're talking about? This is very hard, and it's almost paradoxical, because a second ago, this is the thing that we're not willing to give up on. That's how much we value our conscious experience, but we haven't managed to explain it yet. And maybe this is why what is consciousness has been repeatedly considered to be one of the biggest questions in science. And it's not only because we want to learn more about ourselves, because what we think, what we discover, and what we already know about consciousness affects not only our lives, right? But how we treat other entities such as artificial intelligence or fetuses or non-human animals. So we need a science of consciousness. We need to explain what it is. But a science of consciousness is very hard to think about. And this is because there's this gap between the physical sciences and what we know that happens when we do science objectively, right? And the nature of the phenomenon that we want to study, which is subjective experience. So it's unclear how can we reach through science, through the objective study of the physical, into an explanation of what's it like to watch the sunset and to feel pain and to be aware. And until not long ago, this question wasn't even considered to be a scientific question, with influential scientists such as Sutherland saying in 1989 in the International Dictionary of Psychology, in the definition of consciousness, that it's impossible to specify what it is, what it does, or why it evolved, and saying nothing worth reading has been written on it. So it's no wonder that in the 1990s, most of the work in both cognitive science and the neurosciences made no reference to consciousness. But what Francis Crick and Christoph Koch identified is that in tandem with the technological advancements of the 90s, maybe a way to make progress with consciousness science is by looking at the brain. So this is what we have been doing, and today, consciousness research is considered a viable research topic in cognitive neuroscience. We have many methods and ways to manipulate consciousness in the lab. We have many frameworks and theories of consciousness trying to make this connection between conscious experience and the brain. And we have many experiments that were run over the years using different neuroimaging techniques. But at the same time, the field also feels kind of stuck, because I can save you the time and tell you that in about 35 years, we haven't managed to reach a consensus about what consciousness is, what it does, why it evolved. And this led some philosophers and some researchers to pessimism about consciousness research, about the progress we can even make. So maybe we should just give up. Maybe we should just succumb to the frustration of the explanatory gap and accept the fact that we cannot trust consciousness and will remain mysterious to us. This is not what this conference is about, right? So what I want to talk to you about today is the progress that we are making in the field of consciousness research, and namely 3 ways in which we're doing things differently. And the first one is by changing the way we study consciousness in the lab to match more everyday experiences. And to show what I mean, I need to explain to you the method that was, the approach that was guiding most of the methods so far in consciousness research. And this is to manipulate awareness in the lab. We want to create a situation where sometimes you're aware of something, and in other times you're not aware of it. And then we want to measure the neural activity and identify what in the brain comes with consciousness and goes without it. And then we can pinpoint those neural processes that are unique to conscious experience. And guided by this approach, many, many methods were developed over the years to manipulate consciousness in the lab. But the problem is that most of them are very artificial, and they push us to those very, very weird situations that don't really resonate with anything we are familiar with from our everyday experiences. And to give you an example, masking is a method by which you present something for a very brief duration, and before it or after it, you flash like another pattern. So a letter is presented here, it's masked. This is the way to suppress it from awareness. And if I slow it down, you clearly see which letter it is. Another example for a method is CFS, where one eye is presented with a stimulus, and to suppress it, the other eye is presented with this dynamic flashing pattern, basically making your conscious perception to be of that pattern. And I don't have a design here where I can show you a different stimulus to each eye. It would look something like these. This is just two methods out of many, and you're starting to see the problem here. What is the relationship between these manipulations and the thing we started with that we weren't willing to give up on with the pill, right? There seems to be this tension between the richness of our everyday experiences and what happens to those experiences when you try to tease them apart in the lab. Because in everyday life, we are not bombarded with series of rapid flashes, and we're not presented with completely different inputs to each eye. So this is a known problem, and it is called ecological validity. And actually, in other fields of research, such as social neurosciences, it is very common to discuss it. It was quite overlooked in consciousness science until recently. So one way to make progress is to acknowledge that and try to actively make our manipulations and our experiments more ecologically valid. For example, by changing the stimuli that we use, by changing the measures that we take from people, and by changing the questions that we're asking. An example for that is a recent experiment we performed in the lab with a VR platform that we developed, where participants are immersed in this virtual environment and interact with it instead of seeing static, oversimplified stimuli on a computer screen. So by updating the methods that we use, we can bring realistic designs into well-controlled lab experiments and study consciousness in a more naturalistic way. Another way to do things differently is by fostering collaboration. So I've talked about methods, but this is only one part of the equation, right? To get a systematic understanding of consciousness, we need theories. And boy, do we have many. So similarly to what I've shown you with the methods, we also have many, many theories that try to model consciousness, and specifically its relationship with the physical substrate, with the brain. And while all of them share the same overarching goal, they have very different starting points, which lead to them drawing very different connections between consciousness and the brain. So we saw there are many methods. We saw there are many different models that have different predictions on where should we find consciousness in the brain. What is going on? How can it be that all of these are researched right now in parallel at the same time? Identifying this challenge, we started to see in recent years attempts to bridge this gap. For example, the Accelerating Research on Consciousness attempt from the Templeton World Charity Foundation. And the idea is take a subset of those theories of consciousness at a time, force them to sit together and make predictions about the relationship between consciousness and the brain with a shared paradigm, with shared manipulations and shared measures and shared methods, and then go perform these experiments and see which predictions pan out. So the first one of these adversarial collaborations is called Cogitate, and it took two theories. One is global neuronal workspace theory. The other one is information theory. And each of them draws different connections between consciousness and the brain. One of them conceptualizes it as sort of a workspace that is widespread across the brain and includes, for example, also frontal areas. And the other one identifies consciousness with integration of information, which they predict should be maximal actually in the back of the brain. So proponents of these theories sat together and agreed on a shared experimental paradigm where predictions from both theories can be meaningfully tested. So, for example, for GeneWT, you have a key hypothesis, for example, this hypothesis about this broadcasting of information in the brain. You have the way to test this hypothesis, and importantly, you have the possible outcomes of this experiment and what they would mean for the theory. So both theories did this. This is the one for IIT. And once we have both of these, we can go and run these experiments with different neuroimaging techniques, right? And this is actually way less straightforward and simple than it sounds. This is actually a massive effort that spans across labs all over the world and 3 neural imaging techniques and many, many participants that were run. But the results of this collaboration are out of the scope of this talk. Just not to leave you hanging, I can already tell you that for GNWT, the main challenge was that it could not account for the maintenance of a conscious percept. And for IIT, the main challenge was actually in the specific pattern that they predicted that should be present when you are aware of something that wasn't found. But the point is that when we do science like that, we make the theories refine themselves. We push them to make predictions that they didn't make before. And this is how we can make progress in meaningful tests for theories of consciousness. And at this point, you might be asking yourself, okay, but why should I even care if a theory of consciousness is right or wrong? Why is this interesting? And this is interesting because based on these theories, scientists then go and create tests based on which people make conclusions about the presence of consciousness in other entities. For example, in this study, the tests for consciousness in fetuses were devised based on GNWT assumptions, which leads us to the last part of my talk, which is the importance of examining these assumptions and our intuitions about attributions of consciousness and what we think we need to do with them. So I'll take the example of conscious and artificial intelligence on topic with today's theme. And back in 2022, Inya Sutskever, the co-founder of OpenAI, said that it may be that today's large neural networks are slightly conscious, and to that, Murray Shanahan from Google DeepMind reacted in the same sense that it may be that the large field of wheat is slightly pasta. And these are the experts. These are the experts of artificial intelligence, and we can see that even they have a hard time understanding how to look for indicators of consciousness in AI. And while we have a hard time agreeing on this, it has very real implications because the same experts are telling us, for example, in this example of Blake Lemoine, that based on the assumption that Lambda was conscious, we should have asked for its consent before experimenting on it. So we have a hard time understanding, even at the expert level, how should we test for conscious AI, but at the same time, we have the same experts telling us that thinking that it's conscious should affect the way we treat it. And of course, AI is just one example of the importance of understanding what exactly our intuitions are about consciousness and moral status in other entities. So this is exactly what we went and did. We asked over 1,000 people questions about consciousness and moral status and the relationship between them. And we asked them both explicit questions and presented them with moral dilemmas as well. And to show you some of the results in our preliminary sample, we asked them, for example, if they think consciousness and intelligence are related. And we see it's pretty close between no and yes. And out of those who thought that they were related, most of them thought that it's because consciousness is necessary for intelligence and not the other way around. And if we talk more directly about the relationship between consciousness and moral status, we presented people with 24 different entities. And for each of them, we asked them if they think it's conscious. That would be on the x-axis. We also asked them for each of these entities if they think they have moral status. That will be on the y-axis. So if an entity is on the diagonal, it means that people's thoughts about whether this entity is conscious correspond to whether they think it matters. If it's above the diagonal, it means that people thought about whether it is conscious, well, they think they matter more than they think that they're conscious. And if it's below the diagonal, they actually think that this entity is conscious more than they're willing to say that it morally matters. And what we find is this very strong relationship between consciousness and moral status. So it seems people do converge on this notion that consciousness matters. And if you go back to the Blake Lemoine example, we see large language models are down there with electrons and fungi and things that people thought that neither conscious nor matter morally. And to the question we started with, most people were not willing to give up consciousness with a pill. So these are just a couple of examples to demonstrate that we can map our intuitions. We can make the implicit explicit and inform consciousness research. And to sum up, in just over 30 years, we went from a situation where consciousness wasn't even considered a viable research topic to this proliferation of methods and of theories. Every new method, every attempt to collaborate, every dissection of our intuitions and our assumption takes us a step closer to understanding consciousness. And it's important not just to understand ourselves, but also, as we've seen, to address some of the most pressing questions on how we treat others. Thank you very much.